So those of us who live in Wyoming, we love this state's mountains, and we revel in the repeated wonder of seeing new, breathtaking vistas. But how do we describe those experiences? How do we get beyond, like, oh, wow, amazing, and then silence? How do we get beyond that? Well, what we usually do is we borrow language that has already been said, language created by some of the best wordsmiths in the business. I'm, of course, talking about authors, people who use words for a living and who craft sentences, paragraphs, essays, and books with persistent thought and creative insight. Now, we usually think of American authors when we talk about the American West, but you know, there's a strong connection between the writing of America and the writing in Great Britain. So English and Scottish writers have contributed enormously to this project of natural wonder and description. Our next speaker, Caroline McCracken-Flesher, is uniquely suited to address this topic. A Wyoming resident and a UW professor for more than 25 years, Dr. McCracken-Flesher originally hails from the United Kingdom. She was educated at the University of Edinburgh and then studied at Oxford University before coming to the United States to do her PhD at Brown University. Caroline is the author of 2 major books, Possible Scotlands, Walter Scott and the Story of Tomorrow, and The Doctor Dissected, a cultural autopsy of the Burke and Hare murders, as well as numerous edited articles, anthologies, and editions, and, of course, dozens of scholarly articles. Caroline is a leading expert in Scottish literature and was invited to speak at the Scottish National Parliament in 2015. She was also made an honorary fellow of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies, received Clan Scots Order of the Stag.
You brought me a moose, I'm quite happy.
And recently was elected by the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literature as convener. Convener is a British word that sort of means president. After a UW career during which she earned a number of teaching awards, Caroline was recently recognized by her peers as the George Duke Humphrey Distinguished Professor, an award given to appreciate her lifetime of teaching and academic contributions to the university. This morning, Caroline, Dr. McCracken-Flesher, will speak to us about Writing the Way West, Authors in America.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, sort of tying Scotland and America together through Saturday University. And I want to thank all the people who make that possible. That's Saturday University, the Wyoming Humanities Council, the Sublette BOCES, the Museum of the Mountain Man, where we met yesterday, and the library today. These are wonderful facilities, and it's a real privilege to be here. I noticed as we came into town that Pinedale's motto seems to be all the civilization you need, which I think is a wonderful motto, but I'm going to talk about how 19th century writers shared or didn't share that perception as they came west on the train. And I'm going to start with this person. This is Robert Louis Stevenson. This is the young Robert Louis Stevenson, pretty much as he looked in 1879 when he took the train across America and through Wyoming. And a few years later, you know, you would know him as the author of Treasure Island, right? Or Jekyll and Hyde in 1886. Yes?
Could you use the mic, please?
Okay. I'll do my best. It's a little difficult to juggle. I want to use some quotations, and it's a little difficult to juggle all 3 pieces, but I'll do my best. Or I could speak up. No? Okay. Yes, that's now on. All right. So I'll set this down and pick it up occasionally. So what I'm going to suggest to you, though, is that in Stevenson's travel across America made the difference that allowed him to write these later books. And the travel across America itself produced 2 books, The Amateur Emigrant in 1892 and Across the Plains, 1883. But you'll notice that there's an odd delay in the production of those books if he traveled in 1879. That's for a number of reasons, but the primary one for The Amateur Emigrant, which talks about his voyage from the Clyde outside Glasgow on the boat across to New York, is that his father found what he wrote unacceptable and bought up the edition, and so it disappeared for a while. And we really didn't get a good edition of any of this until the mid-20th century, and we're still working on producing a really good edition. But so this is in 1879. before he's written Treasure Island, Jekyll and Hyde, Kidnapped, and while he's traveling across America. We're going to begin with Stevenson because his view from the train is particularly interesting, I think. All right, now, Stevenson had just published, he had a yen to travel. He had just published this book, Edinburgh Picturesque Notes. He's an Edinburgh kid. And he was dying to get away from Edinburgh. I mean, literally dying to get away from Edinburgh. If you know anything about Stevenson, it's probably that he was sick a lot of the time. And he was a pampered Edinburgh boy. His parents were very cautious of his health, as they might well be. But he felt quite penned in. People who visit Edinburgh, and I'm an Edinburgh graduate, think it's a wonderful, open, fantastic, windy city, a lot like here. But he found it a bit much. And he says, many aspire angrily after that somewhere else of the imagination. They lean over the great bridge, that's the great bridge that joins parts of Edinburgh, and they watch the trains smoking out from under them and vanishing into the tunnel on a voyage to brighter skies. Happy the passengers who shake off the dust of Edinburgh. So he's really keen to get going. And he had become known as a writer of travel texts, of his experiences in travel. He had written An Inland Voyage, which was about his travels in a canoe around the Low Countries. And he had produced in 1879, it had just come out, Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes in France. He had wandered around, just him and a donkey. And then he'd written it up and been beginning to be quite successful. But when he sets out for America, he wants to be something different. He wants to be a traveler and not a tourist. And he's quite self-conscious about the difference. This is the shipping manifest, and this is the line that has him in it. Robert Stevenson, age 29, where he comes from, calls him a clerk, because his profession was lawyer, so CLK, and various other pieces, going to USA. Nun. Does anybody know what the nun refers to?
Reason is destination?
Actually, no. No? It's better than that. The column that comes out of, it's headed died. So it was good that there was none in the died on voyage column. So he survived the voyage. But it was a pretty rough voyage. So for instance, when he arrives in New York, he goes searching for mercuric powder to dust his wrists. He's picked up a parasite on the ship. He talks about, he decided to travel not quite steerage. The story we all hear is that he traveled steerage. He didn't. He said he wanted a desk, and so he had to travel one level up from steerage. But he had some remarkable experiences while traveling. For instance, there's one night, which is quite graphic, he comes across someone being really very, very ill. And he kneels down to help him, and the gentleman who's ill and is from steerage, and so is an emigrant in some desperation to get to America, holds out his handkerchief to Stevenson and says, "Mind, you've got your knee in the vomit." And this is the kind of thing that Edinburgh's middle-class parents, back in Edinburgh, didn't really want their son to be publishing, that he'd had these kinds of experiences of getting parasitic infestations, etc., on the ship. And so this is one of the reasons why this part of the record disappears for a while, but that was Stevenson's experience. And he's very deliberately intending to turn these voyages into a book as well, right? That's his intent. He's a writer. He's making experience into text. So you'd think that, taking the Transcontinental Railroad would be just what he was ready for, right? All the excitement and everything. And the Transcontinental has just been completed, 1869. So it's 1879. He's now on it. So it's had a little time to settle. And it should be a really fascinating, wonderful experience. And certainly Stevenson was expecting it to be. This picture from 1861, Emanuel Gottlieb Lutz, westward the course of empire takes its way. And Stevenson, early in his travels, says, "This is what I was going to do." And he gives a near quote. He says, "Westward the course of empire holds its way. That's what I'm going to do. It's going to be fabulous." And now I want to tell you a little bit about what it was actually like. I'm going to stand here so I can turn over my pages and give you the precise quotations, because I won't remember them as well as they deserve to be expressed. So this is the lights that he has in his memory, or his mind. And as he's getting through Ohio, he says, all through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, for the land was rich and various. The tall corn pleased the eye. The trees framed the plain into long and aerial vistas. And the clean, bright garden townships spoke of country fare and pleasant summer evenings on the stoop. It was a sort of flat paradise, right? So at this point, it's still fascinating to him. And he's getting along quite well. He's a few days out of New York. Then he comes to Nebraska. And that starts well. He says, at sea on the plains of Nebraska, right? That's a wonderful expression, and it goes with all the things we expect about, the wide open prairie and everything. He says, I sat on the top of the fruit wagon by the hour to spy about me. But it begins to pall, because he says, to spy for something new. It was a world almost without a feature, an empty sky, an empty earth. And he doesn't quite know how to process all that emptiness, right? What is it? Is it old? Is it new? And he says, this extreme newness is what he decides it is. Isn't that an interesting choice? This extreme newness. Above all, in so naked and flat a country, gave a strong impression of artificiality. Right? It's so new, it has to be somehow fake. The mind is loath to accept it for a piece of reality, and it seems incredible that life can go on. Or people find entertainment in so bare a playroom. Right? So it's beginning to pall. And you think, in that circumstance, optimistically, we think, okay, well, Wyoming, it's going to be great. He's going to get to Wyoming, and it's just going to be fantastic. Because we know he's going to, hit the high point on the Transcontinental Railroad, right? He's going to, come over at the top. He's going to loop around. He's going to loop around Laramie. It's going to be lovely, right? He's going to go through all that great scenery. And this is how it's described at the time, because remember, the railroad is still quite new. So this is the highest point on the Transcontinental Railroad at the right there. That's Sherman Station. And then it's all down, up, up, and then down to California, right? That's what he has ahead of us. Should be really quite something. And they stop at Sherman Station. And Sherman Station in 1869, right, when it's new, Harper's magazine describes it, because everything is so exciting and it's in the magazines. It says, Sherman, Wyoming Territory, is the highest point attained by the Pacific Railway. 15 months ago, nothing but bare hills and crags marked this spot. Now there is a little town containing a large machine shop, a Wells Fargo express office, newspaper shops, and even a millinery store. Its 2 hotels of shingle are of a rough kind, but good meals are to be obtained in them. So that's where he's stopping before they crest the ridge and they head down toward Laramie. Okay. Well, what did Stevenson make of Wyoming? He says, alas, and it was a worse country than the other. All Sunday and Monday we traveled through these sad mountains. Hour after hour it was the same unhomely and unkindly world about our onward path. Tumbled boulders, cliffs that drearily imitate the shape of monuments and fortifications. Not a tree, not a patch of sward, not one shapely or commanding mountain. Sagebrush, eternal sagebrush. Except for the air, there was not one good circumstance in that God-forsaken land. Isn't it interesting to see the places you take for granted through someone else's eyes, right? That's how it seemed to him. So, and it didn't get any better as he traveled. So what did he actually see? Well, at Sherman Station, at least, right? This is how Sherman Station was represented at the time. So, tiny little town, but sort of interesting, you'd think. He would have seen to the north, perhaps, Beecher. He says the air is clear, so he should have had a good view. It is August, but not fire season for him, right? He could see things. Whoops. And he could have seen to the south, he could have seen the Colorado peaks. When you're at Sherman, the view is actually quite good if you are ready to appreciate it. Well, why was he not ready to appreciate it? For one thing, he was rushing to California, because it wasn't just that he was writing a book of travels or trying to get away from his parents. He was trying to get to this lady who was in California. He had met her in France a few years ago. She was a married lady, but that wasn't stopping him. And eventually, she was going to be Fanny Van de Grift Stevenson. But right now, she was still Mrs. Osborne. But Sam had been involved in the wars, and Sam Osborne wasn't exactly very biddable himself, and his days were numbered. But Stevenson was going on spec out to California to see Fanny Van de Grift Osborne. So he had another destination in his eye, right? He wasn't necessarily interested too much in what he was passing through. Here's another thing to bear in mind. So up at the top, the fifth entry down is Sherman. Right before that, it's Hazard, Otto, Granite Canyon, Buford. And people know about Buford, right? Findlay town with one resident these days, but Buford and Sherman. Okay, these are all the stops that the train took on this page between about the peak and then down to here is Evanston. Okay, this many stops. This wasn't the fastest train in the world. At one point he says it's going 18 miles an hour. I'm not sure at what point of the route that is. It's a sort of general statement. But you'll notice, I think I've got a misprint here, but on this side you can see Sherman, 3:45 in the afternoon, 5 o'clock Laramie, almost 9 o'clock Medicine Bow, 12:20 in the morning Rawlins, Red Desert, 3 o'clock in the morning. It's taking a long time, right? And days actually pass on the route, right? Many days. So it's taking a while. Evanston and Ogden. For some of it, we should bear this in mind, for some of it he's traveling at night, so some of his general statements might not be entirely fair. And here's the other thing. The evening we left Laramie, I fell sick outright. Remember that he had come off the boat in New York with a few ailments. They increased as he traveled west. He either insisted on sitting on top of the train, which it might have been bright and airy but smoky, and he had a lung complaint. Or he traveled inside, and there he's talking frequently about how dreadful it smells, how muggy it is, how terrible the food is. And by the time he gets to Laramie, he does say, maybe I've picked up some food poisoning in some of the other towns, but Laramie he has a special place of loathing for, because when I got to Laramie, the evening we left Laramie, I fell sick outright. So he's actually very ill passing through Wyoming. And that also means that even though it's night, he's up through the night. Remember, he's got some kind of stomach complaint, so he's not able to lie down and just go to sleep. And so he talks about seeing all these gray masses of land just sort of passing by. So not a happy camper. But he's sort of aware of the issues in traveling and how you perceive things as you go. So when he gets to New York, he knows that he's traveling, sort of carrying some codes with him. And let me see if I can find. I'm not finding. Whoops. Yes. He says, on the way into New York, they're still on the boat, and he says, "You would have thought we were about to land on some cannibal island," he says. "You must speak," this is what people are saying on the boat, "you must speak to no one in the streets, as they would not leave you till you were rooked and beaten. You must enter a hotel with military precautions, for the least you had to apprehend was to awake next morning without money or baggage, or necessary raiment, no clothing, a lone forked radish in a bed. And if the worst befell, you would instantly and mysteriously disappear from the ranks of mankind," right? So to get off the boat in New York, and he wasn't traveling steerage, remember? He talks about the other people who have to go through immigration. He doesn't, because he's a tourist, not a traveler, when he gets off the boat in New York, for convenience sake. And he says, "That's what people told me, but you know, it's okay. I knew these stories because I had heard exactly the same stories when I was traveling around France." Right? You must be careful what inn you go to, because, you know, in the night somebody will come out from behind a curtain and rob you. So he knows that these are stories, but he does go on to actually then repeat the same story, and it's classic, "Oh, but there was a man on the boat who said this had really happened to his friend." So it's absolute urban legend in circulation, but he's trying to think about how much of the urban legend to take seriously, how to sort of wink at you and tell you he knows that it's still a story, but he tells the story anyway. So he carries this sort of portfolio of stories and this awareness of story, but he really doesn't know how to engage with the stories he meets across the West. And I'm going to concentrate on Laramie because that one's close to my heart, but you can track this across the state. So for instance, coming from Sherman Station, he would have crossed what was then the tallest bridge at the highest point in the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a miracle of engineering. It had been wood, it had wobbled quite a bit, then they replaced it with metal, and it was a remarkable thing. And since he was in Sherman Station at about 5:45, 6 in the evening, he should have known and been alert to the fact that he was crossing this marvel of engineering. Coming down into Laramie, well, you know, Wyoming Territory had given the vote to women in 1869. Louisa Swain had voted in 1870. Stevenson was about to marry Fanny Osborne, who was a very outspoken American woman. He would write a book about men's and women's relationship called Virginibus and Puerisque, about young women and young men, and it's quite a liberal book. Nothing in his memoir about, "and now I was in the territory where women voted." Didn't notice. He also didn't notice, and we've probably forgotten, that in 1879, Laramie was aspiring to be the Pittsburgh of the West. And when I first came across these pictures that show really quite large factory installations, I had no idea what they were, and I thought they were an artist's sort of impression of what Laramie might be like. But in fact, Laramie had major rolling mills because it was a major point on the railway, and the railway was bringing industrialization with it along the line. This one, I think, is particularly fun. So Stephen's up at Sherman, and within 2 years, the Ames Monument is going to be built at Sherman. This thing, and it has, you'll notice, a relief portrait on either side of the two Ames brothers, right, the New York robber barons who helped build or finance the railway. 2 years later, after this goes up, and 3 years after Stevenson is at Sherman, he meets August St. Gaudens, who then produces a medallion of Stevenson that he issues in about 1887. So this is a lovely moment where paths sort of overlay in time, but nobody knows about anybody else at this moment, and so they kind of miss one another. It's a lovely story of moments missed, and Stevenson did not feel anybody walking over his grave, so to speak, a few years ahead. Okay, so that's Stevenson, and I'm going to put him in a little bit of context for you, because he's not alone crossing the country. He's not alone trying to understand what he sees. And this is somebody who's, I think, very familiar in this part of the country, John Wesley Powell, who 10 years before Stevenson had come across, of course not on the train, but aiming to go down the river. And for Powell, that experience is also challenging in language. It challenges us because in 1867, I think this microphone's cutting in and out, isn't it? Yes. Would I be better without it?
No.
No? Okay, I'll do my best. He had just walked part of the canyon with his wife. In 1869, he goes down the river for the first time, and that's the one we remember. He goes down again a few years later. And when he takes his experiences eventually back to Washington and is describing them, and they're saying, why didn't you write it up more fully? And they say, well, we want to see the full report before we finance somebody else. And that's when he writes and brings this together as a kind of composite narrative. Okay? So this picture is actually from the last voyage. But we'll be thinking about 1869. And in 1869, as Powell is going down the river, he names things as he goes. And this becomes actually a big argument about when things got named, whether they got named in the first voyage or a later voyage. But in the book, he says, May 30th, we go around something that's kind of got a big horseshoe shape. So we call it Horseshoe Canyon. How many times is he going to be able to do that as he goes down the Grand Canyon, do you think? How many horseshoes is he likely to meet? So that language is going to become exhausted quite quickly.
Right.
May 30th, thank you, kingfishers are playing. We adopt as names. You can see how this is working, can't you? Kingfisher Creek, Kingfisher Park, Kingfisher Canyon. Okay, we've used up all the kingfishers. Something has the appearance of a colossal beehive, so we name it Beehive Point. What I'd like to suggest to you about this is that there's a deliberate sort of literalism here. So he's a surveyor. He doesn't want to get too expressive. He's trying to just name things as he sees them. However, as they go down the river, it gets a little choppy. And before long, they have hit Disaster Falls, and it's retroactively named Disaster Falls because it was disastrous, right? That's the first big capsizing and breaking of boats and everything else. But they've already, he says, named it the Canyon of Lodore, right? The Gates of Lodore. Hands up those who have heard the word Lodore without being associated with the Grand Canyon. One person. And so it's not a word that we can use to just describe something. It's not obvious. But where he got it from is this. It's a poem by Robert Southey. Robert Southey was one of those lake poets, right, who hangs out with Coleridge and Wordsworth in the English lakeland. And the poem begins with a little boy asking the speaker, how does the water come down at Lodore? And in Britain, Lodore is the name of this cataract, this waterfall. And it begins, the cataract strong plunges along, striking and raging as if a war waging, its caverns and rocks among. And then it keeps tumbling down, collecting, projecting, receding and speeding and shocking and rocking and darting and parting and threading and etc. You can see how this is building until you get close to the end, delaying and straying and playing and spraying, advancing and prancing and glancing and dancing, etc.
Clapping and slapping.
And clapping and slapping and all those great words, right? So they're very, to do with the sound of it. There's a shape to this poem. It comes down in a torrent. It is a poem beloved of drama clubs. And I've seen lots of versions of it where people enact these words, right, as a dance. So it's a shape poem, it's a sound poem. Again, it can't quite name the thing. So it goes for the sound and the energy and all the rest of it. And so when Powell and his group choose this word to name the place, they're choosing something that's kind of taking, on the one hand, is trying to deal with what they're hearing and seeing, but is also taking a step back into British Romanticism. So somehow the experience is overwhelming the words that you have to express it. All right, so now, but Powell isn't the only comparator I want you to think about. This is Oscar Wilde. And if Stevenson went across in 1879, Wilde comes in 1882. And he does take the train across the continent. He has actually even less to say about Wyoming, but he says a lot about other things. And when Wilde comes, he's the same age as Stevenson was. He, however, comes, if Stevenson came sort of under the radar, he goes into a New York bookshop and they don't know who he is, even though his book is on the shelf. Wilde comes with a whole fanfare. He's coming as the apostle of aestheticism, to the wilds of America. And he travels everywhere. He sort of cross-hatches the country. There is a scholar who has a website that's trying to figure out all the places that Oscar Wilde visited, and it's still building. He's not done yet. So he might have stopped in Wyoming, but so far as we know, he didn't. But he goes to like 150 places. And before he gets off the boat, they already know lots about him. 1881, he had published a book of poems. 1881, he was immediately spoofed by Gilbert and Sullivan in Patience, where Bunthorne, the precious young man who runs around in a green waistcoat and carrying a flower, is a direct parody of Oscar Wilde. And Patience was a big success with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company in London. Then it comes across to New York. And so New York has had the way paved for Oscar Wilde before he arrives. The same impresario who mounts Patience also runs Oscar Wilde's tour, right? So there's Oscar Wilde, the poet, there's the parody in Patience, and then there's the tour that's run by the same guy who runs the parody. Can you see sort of commercial industry at work here? And they build the buzz for his tour on the boat. And so they telegraph to land. Oscar Wilde, I am not exactly pleased with the Atlantic, says Oscar Wilde from the boat. And then in the Pall Mall Gazette, the Atlantic replies, I am disappointed in Mr. Wilde, signed the Atlantic. Right? So this is a performance for Wilde as he comes. And is taken as such. So there are dances and pieces of music composed for his visit. He is compared to P.T. Barnum's Jumbo the Elephant. Right? There's little Oscar Wilde, and there's Jumbo wearing an Oscar Wilde kind of sunflower that he picked up in America. And Wilde, of course, has plenty to say. He goes to Leadville, Colorado, and this is the place where if you know the phrase, don't shoot the piano player, he's doing his best, it's because Oscar Wilde writes about it and says he saw this as a card on a piano in Leadville. But he says, Leadville, the richest city in the world. It has also got the reputation of being the roughest, and every man carries a revolver. At least he hopes so, right? Because that's dramatic. I was told that if I went there, they would be sure to shoot me or my traveling manager. I wrote and told them that nothing they could do to my traveling manager would intimidate me. They are miners, men working in metals, and remember, he's an aesthete. He loves pottery and everything like that. They're miners, men working in metals, so I lectured them on the ethics of art. I read them passages from the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, and they seemed much delighted. Now, America, as I said, was sort of expecting him, and Bill Nye, and we know who Bill Nye, the Western humorist, right, said, if Wilde landed in New York on the 2nd of January, by the 22nd of January, he already had enough of a reputation established in the land that Nye wanted to say something back, and he says, soft-eyed seraphic cuss with limber legs and lily on the side, we greet you from the raw and uncouth West. The cowboy yearns to yank thee to his brawny breast and squeeze thy palpitating gizzard through thy vest. Sit on the fuzzy cactus, king of poesy. And song, ride the fierce bronco over the dusty plain, and let the zephyrs sing amidst thy buttery locks. He's got long blonde hair. We'll gladly gather up thy shattered remnants with a broom and ship thee to thy beauteous home. We'll send you back in a hurry. Forget us not, thou bilious pelican from o'er the sea. Right? And of course, the pelican comes to scoop things up, right, and take them away. So, Oscar Wilde in the American Landscape, this is a cartoon from the time. For him, visiting America is all about Oscar, right? He's coming to display himself, to visit his wisdom upon the hicks of Leadville, to turn them into something entertaining he can ship home. They, however, find him equally remarkable, strange, and funny, but neither really engages with the other, right? It's performance every direction. And this is the problem. As you can see from this nice multicolored poster for the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy Railroad, it tells you everywhere you can get to, right? Look, from Peoria, you can get to Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Montana, Nevada, California, Kansas. But you can't get to Wyoming. Or at least you can, but it's just, it's sort of a you can't get there from here kind of phenomenon, right? How do you recognize this place that is still, in its own terms, either very old, with codes that are invisible to you, Native American codes, or very new, where you just arrived. And you're Oscar Wilde on the train, so you literally just arrived, or Stevenson. How do you say anything about it? Well, again, Stevenson had a set of codes. But he figures out as he's traveling along that they don't really work too well. Let me see if I can find you this bit. He says, Ohio had early been the favorite home of my imagination. I have played at being in Ohio by the week and enjoyed some capital sport there with a dummy gun, my person being still unbreeched, so he's still little enough to be running around in his short skirts, and he loved playing cowboys. My preference was founded on a work which appeared in Cassell's family paper. It narrated the doings of one Custaloga, an Indian brave, who in the last chapter washed the paint off his face and became Sir Reginald somebody or other, a trick I never forgave him. In other words, you know, the lost son who's been adopted by the native tribe and who turns out to be the lord of the manor. And Stevenson finds that this is a real letdown in the plot. He says, the idea of a man being an Indian brave and giving it up to be a baronet was one my mind rejected. It offended verisimilitude, you know, that if you were an Indian brave, you wouldn't want to become a baronet. But he says, just in general, Ohio was not as he had pictured it. He sees Native Americans standing by the line. He sees them in cast-off Western clothes. He sees them displaced. And he recognizes that something is wrong in the landscape, that something that he expected to see differently is not available to him. He also brings the code supplied by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had been in Scotland quite recently and signed the guest book at Walter Scott's house. And he says, though, when he meets a black waiter in Pittsburgh, he says that he was strikingly unlike the creations of Mrs. Beecher Stowe. Imagine a gentleman, certainly somewhat dark, speaking English with a slight and rather odd foreign accent. Every inch a man of the world, and armed with manners, and this is his real surprise, so patronizingly superior that I'm at a loss to name their parallel in England. He came prepared to patronize somebody and to support them, and he discovered that really, as people, they didn't need to be patronizing. They were fine themselves, thank you very much. I had come prepared to pity the poor black man, to put him at his ease, to prove in 1,000 condescensions that I was no sharer in the prejudice of race. But I assure you, he says, I put my patronage away. You know, this person didn't need my patronage. They were significant and important. Whitman, you'd think, would be significant because Whitman is one of Stevenson's, the people that he really honors. But where Whitman tries to express and capaciously everything, one of the things Stevenson notices is that these little towns that he's relying on to sort of place him, they spring up, they disappear. There's lots of energy in the landscape, but you can't tell where it's going. And so he's really kind of lost. All right. So, what do you do? Well, for Stevenson, this guy is informative. This is Walter Scott, who never got to America. Walter Scott, though, set all kinds of patterns for understanding landscape in the 19th century. And let's see. I want to show you this. There's a literary theorist called Susan Stewart who says that one of the reasons that landscape is so difficult to us and why we are so keen to code it is that we actually fear the landscape when we've got no stories to tell about it, no words to name it, no way to place ourselves within it. And she says all the describing we do, what it does is it maps the unknown onto the known. And Scott is sort of a past master at doing that and teaches people how to do it. Let me see. I'm going to find you a passage. So this is from a poem called The Lady of the Lake. And it begins with a stag hunt by horse. And the verse goes, "Yelled on the view the opening pack, rock, glen, and cavern paid them back. To many a mingled sound at once the awakened mountain gave response. 100 dogs bayed, deep and strong, clattered 100 steeds along." Right? Lots of energy in the landscape, lots of movement. The landscape's almost moving underneath your feet. And in fact, it does move under your feet because very soon, he says, "'Twas long to tell what steeds gave o'er." Right? The horses almost can't keep up with the extent of the landscape. "'Twere long to tell what steeds gave o'er, as swept the hunt through Cambus Moor. What reins were tightened in despair when rose Ben Leddy's ridge in air, who flagged upon Bocastle's heath, who shunned to stem the flooded teeth." And all of a sudden, this unnamed landscape has lots of names in it. Right? Ben Ledy is the name of the mountain. The Teeth is the name of the river. This is a landscape that's been named. You can find out where you are in it. And the writer is kind of gathering up the place names as he goes. And Scott taught all sorts of people how to see the American West. So that, for instance, this is Turner's picture of Crichton Castle that he drew to support Scott's writing. So Turner, J.M.W. Turner, was an illustrator for Walter Scott. And what they privileged was always the prospect, right? The thing that you can see down the line. There's Crichton Castle. And Moran is a fan of Scott and of Turner, and when he sees the American West, similarly, he's invested in the prospect. Okay? So the landscape, to some degree, is visually coded. And for us now, it's a landscape that's all written over. And in fact, this bottom picture at the Buffalo Bills Center for the West is made up of all the things that people, you can hear when you're standing by Old Faithful and places like that, and people say, "Did you remember to turn off the gas before you left the house? Is the cooler closed, or is the food going to go off? Where is little Johnny?" All those things are written into the landscape. Okay? It becomes a written landscape. Problem for Stevenson, no such writing for him to understand, or none that he could recognize as he travels across the country. Where things are named, deeply problematic, because on that timetable that I showed you with all those little images, things are called Castle Rock or Echo Canyon. Right, so not such and such a castle, just Castle Rock. Remember, he says tumbled rocks and boulders, things that imitate monuments. Well, in his timetable, it said monument rocks. Well, monument to what? Right? Just monument. Or 1,000-mile tree. 1,000 miles from, 1,000 miles to? Where actually are you? It's difficult to place yourself in the landscape. But it's not an unknown Scottish problem. It's the problem that Walter Scott was trying to deal with when he was trying to introduce people to, English people, to the Scottish landscape they didn't know. But it was distinctly a problem because if you can see, this map is actually kind of shifting. And it indicates all the types of maps they had from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. that just aren't quite sure where to situate Scotland, literally. So it's a kind of an ongoing problem. If we depend on the landscape to situate ourselves, we kind of need to know where it is. We need to know how it's named, and then we can know who we are. Because remember, we fear the landscape without writing, Susan Stewart says. Okay, so John Wesley Powell, who tries his best just to describe things and gets kind of overtaken by the experience. Oscar Wilde, who doesn't try very hard at all and mostly describes himself as he goes. And Stevenson doing his best. And I'm coming to the courage to be lost, because I think this is the thing that Stevenson actually learns from traveling across Wyoming on the train. One of the novels that he goes back to write is Kidnapped. Has anybody read Kidnapped? Okay, then you'll know it's a story about a boy who gets stolen away from his home, gets shipwrecked off the north of Scotland, and then is trying to get, the west of Scotland, is trying to get home through Scotland. However, even in Scotland, he doesn't actually know where he is. He's always lost. He's always falling into the bog. He's always stuck on a rock in the middle of a river, trying to figure out where the heck he's supposed to be going. He really doesn't know. And so I think that that experience of being lost comes into Kidnapped. I think that Stevenson's love for maps comes in part out of that experience of traveling across America. Nearly Treasure Island has a map, right? People know that map. Kidnapped has a big fold-out map in the beginning of it. And we have lots of information about how he talked to his illustrator about how to develop that map. And on the one hand, he wanted lots of names on it. On the other hand, he said, the line should be sometimes broken. Because sometimes David, the main character, has no idea where he is. He's just wandering. The line should be sometimes broken. All right, so to conclude, if you really want to get lost in a landscape with all the virtues that that can bring as an author, I think the place where you want to begin is a place we know very well. To get lost in the landscape, the first thing you want to do is find yourself in Wyoming. Thank you very much. And we do have a few minutes for questions. Is that right, Paul?
Yes.
10 minutes. Or things that you know that I don't. I'm very well aware that this is Green River country and Powell country, and that there are things to share.
The construct of the native turning into finding out that he's barren.
Yes.
And I don't have my literary timetable quite right, but it sounds a bit like Tarzan. Did that predate or postdate? I think postdate.
Tarzan is later, right? Tarzan is early 20th century.
But still,
Oh yes, the question was the issue, the construct of someone discovering that they're the long-lost orphan child of nobility, and whether Tarzan predates or postdates. Tarzan postdates, but it's a distinct phenomenon. I mean, it's the phenomenon of the orphan child who turns out to be someone else is an 18th century idea. It's Oliver Twist. Right? It's sort of the classic narrative of an unstable society, actually, that has all those, the childhood desire of, you're not really my parents. My parents would be nicer to me than this. Getting enacted at the larger cultural level for a society that's very in flux because of industrialism, and where people are moving off the land into cities, right? A great deal, and losing, losing that plotted landscape, right? The landscape where you know everything, and going to the big city morass, which is the other wilderness of the time. Yes?
I just want to make a comment about Powell.
Yes, please.
If you read Powell's biography of his descent into the Colorado River system, and he really had a hard time trying to make it as vivid as one really was. But then if you go read Wallace Stegner, The 100th Meridian, he does an excellent job. I mean, if you read Stegner, it really makes you appreciate what Powell actually did. But if you read Powell, he held it back. He couldn't really explain it to the magnificence that it was.
Yeah. It really is interesting, isn't it? I think when the issue is the comparison between Powell, who has difficulty describing, and then Wallace Stegner, who makes it so much more vivid, is Powell's, I think, being the surveyor, right, being the geologist, and being the ethnographer eventually, is very keen to just state it as he sees it, and he's kind of trying to fight off the expressive language sometimes. And I have wondered if why the gates of Lodore come to him so trippingly, why suddenly it's going to be the gates of Lodore is because he had just walked part of that with his wife. Maybe they sat up on the hill and thought, oh look, and maybe she was more attuned to romantic poetry than he was. It's hard to tell, but the challenge to express something so unknown, right? There would be no equivalent experience in the East, and certainly no equivalent for the British people who came west. It really defied language. And so they're looking around for a language and trying different things. Yes, John.
Just a point on Stegner, he's a son of the West. That's all he's known. Part of what you're explaining is what it's like if you're someone new to a place. There's always a gulf between those who have lived in a place and grown there and those who come to it.
I think that is absolutely right. And Stevenson, that's part of his problem. He doesn't know Native American words, he doesn't know the new ones. But Stegner has a further advantage because he's writing after all these people, right? So the language has sort of built up, and the names have solidified, and more clearly, there are lots of Shermans across America, I'm presuming, because of the general. And Sherman, Wyoming, popped up and is now gone, right, because the railroad shifted. But over time, names do begin to connect and do build their histories and get anchored, and then it's a very different experience to be in the landscape. Paul?
I would ask a question about a different set of Powell's names, namely the names in the Grand Canyon. When he actually gets down there, he's sort of run out of, rock and that kind of stuff. So he throws out religious names, like the Temple of Shiva and, the Plain of Artaxerxes and this kind of stuff. And it actually gets picked up in later geological descriptions of those layers. Mm-hmm. And so, do you have any thoughts and reactions to where all this religious language, names, kind of stuff?
I think what I would say about that is it's kind of endemic in the culture, right? And so that's an available naming pattern. But tracing names in America across the country is just fascinating. When Stevenson is noticing names carefully, and he's going through the Ohio Valley, and he begins to sort of riff on all these wonderful native names, and where it's, again, that's an older landscape in his terms, right? It's a more inhabited landscape. And so it's kind of settled in. And he can hear the romance of those names. But if I were to think about, and he doesn't have that experience, and Wyoming, the names are newer. But what I was going to say about the waves of naming is that other author I mentioned, Walter Scott, who sort of set the ways to see some things traveling west. Romantic prospects, right? On the one hand, the West is full of wonderful prospects. But Oscar Wilde says, there never was a sunset until the Impressionists, and then we started to notice them. Same kind of thing, right? There never was a prospect until the Romantic authors who figured them, and then we start to notice them. Well, Walter Scott himself, you can track names in waves from his novels across America. There are dozens of Kenilworths and Waverleys and Ivanhoes and Melroses, and they all come from Scott novels. But I think, I think the cultural anthropologist is the person to really address this question. Bob, I'm thinking about the first time I was in, I think it's Lincoln, Nebraska, and I discovered there's streets that are named for letters as well as for numbers. I was perplexed. I had never come across such a thing before, right? So naming is a challenge. And we name according to codes and sets that we have. And so for Powell, one available set would be biblical terms. But the interesting thing with the journal, when you look at the journal, is by the press of experience. And you know, they were having a really rough time and they were running out of food as they're getting down the river. He stops putting very much at all in the actual journal. It becomes just a couple of words. And so, for instance, I think it's the day when two of the party depart and are never seen again. He just says, the boys left us. Right? And then there's a couple of other things about how far they get down the river, and that's it. And so you can sense the kind of exhaustion in trying to meet this enormous landscape, which is, and just the enormity is very unfamiliar. But then to actually map yourself onto it by being able to have a name for something, it's exhausting in the 19th century. There's so much, right? And it's either so overwhelming or so new, or so, when Stevenson is being negative, the same, right? But I really wish he had looked out of the train window more when he was at Sherman Station. And I should stop at that point. I think I've run out of time. Thank you so much for your questions.